The tape recorder and I couldn't find it. All right, hello everybody. It's 8:30, so we might as well start on time. I know that some people are having parking issues, so I anticipate there'll be people coming in. But welcome everybody to the City Club and to our first Case Downtown presentation of the year. I'm Michael Scharf. I'm the co-dean of the law school. And how many of you are alums of the law school? I think most of you. All right. Well, thank you for being alums and supporters of the law school and coming in. Those of you who aren't, welcome guests. We're glad that you've joined us as well. Someone asked me where that picture was taken, and I joked, we had the dean's office refurbed so that it looked just like the Oval Office. But that's actually one of the things that deans have to do is recruit students, and I was in Texas at Texas A&M and at Baylor and a couple other places. And at Texas A&M, they have the new Bush Library and Museum, and they actually, this is Bush Sr., and they actually have the replica of the Oval Office there. So that shot was there. The phone is white, go figure. I thought there'd be like a red phone so I could talk to Putin or something, but didn't happen. So today we're going to be talking about international law and the Trump administration. And this, as I said, is the first of our presentations of the year. This is the year that our law school is celebrating its 125th anniversary. It's a big milestone for our school. And so we are having on October 6th a really big alumni dinner with all the faculty and all the alumni, not just the years that are on fives, but everybody that wants to come. And it's going to be in the Western Reserve Historical Society. We've published a book about the 125 years of the law school, which is a big coffee table book. And we're selling that just at cost for $30. We also have a video that we've produced. Originally, we were going to have a voice that sounded like James Earl Jones, but then it sounded weird. We kept thinking he was going to say, "Luke, I am your father." So we went for another voice, but the video has come out very well as well. If there's time at the end of my presentation, I'll give you an update about the law school. And I think also as part of this presentation, there are people in the room, a lot of them, that are experts at the various sub-issues that I'll be covering. And so what I'd like to do is have this more of a discussion. Is there a microphone for people? There is one. Okay, so just raise your hand if you want to chime in at any time. And do we have someone that will run the mic over? I guess you'll. Okay, so and the microphone will magically appear. All right, so let's start off with something provocative to get our juices flowing in the morning. This statement is by Jack Goldsmith. He is a Republican appointee, was the Assistant Attorney General under the Bush Jr. administration. And he said that, Jack Goldsmith. He said that we are witnessing the beginnings of the greatest presidential onslaught on international law and international institutions in American history. So we've seen like half a year of the Trump administration so far. It's certainly not been boring. Every day we open the newspaper and there's something new that will either get you really mad and in some cases get you really excited, I guess, depending on your views on these things. But let's look at some of the international law issues related to what Trump has done so far and see if this bears out. So first of all, this is the Trump foreign policy team. And I've crossed out the people on the team that have resigned so far, and some people have moved up. If you look at this list, basically what some people, insiders, believe is going on is that there is a Darwinian struggle for the heart and mind of Donald Trump when it comes to international law and foreign relations. And you can look at the different people on the list and you can sort of guess which side they are on the struggle. Now, my own view is that there's a Darwinian struggle in the mind itself of Donald Trump, and that these folks are on the periphery more than actually influencing him, because he does seem to make decisions all on his own, but not necessarily in a consistent way. And sometimes it's about who's getting news to him, and I know that there's been news reports lately that the new chief of staff won't let him read some of the news reports that were more along the lines of like very slanted news that he was getting from Bannon when he was there. Okay, so the first thing is that Donald Trump and his team have been making deep cuts to the U.S. Department of State. And for a while, they just weren't filling any positions at all. And it makes it very hard for the Secretary of State to run diplomacy when he doesn't have a team. Many of the civil servants have left because they didn't like the direction that foreign policy was going in, and the assistant secretary level positions were unfilled. Now, just last week, August 27th, I guess 2 weeks ago, Tillerson sends a letter to Congress, and he says, we're going to close down a bunch of offices. This is not just not filling positions. This is closing down offices. And it gives you a sense of where priorities are. So they closed down the Special Advisor for Disabilities Rights, the Special Representative for International Labor Affairs, the Special Envoy for Climate Change. No surprise there, I suppose. The Coordinator for Sanctions Policy, the Coordinator for Iran Nuclear Implementation, the Envoy for the closure of Gitmo, and there were many others on the list. Among the offices slated for closure was the Office of the Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues. And that's an office where, because my specialty is war crimes, I've got a big interest. A number of people who had served in that capacity or who supported having that office actually started a major media campaign, like they do for television series that are about to be cut. Save our show. This was Save Our Office. And that was one of the few offices that has been saved. Now the question is, who will they fill it with? Because sometimes the Trump administration will fill agencies and departments with people whose stated goal is to dismantle the agency or department. And we are hopeful that the person who gets the job of Ambassador at Large for War Crimes issues will care about prosecuting war criminals and not trying to break down the machinery of international prosecutions under a misguided fear that someday the U.S. itself might be prosecuted. We'll just wait and see on that. Okay, so the very first major foreign policy initiative. He runs on this platform, he gets elected, and he says the TPP is dead. And the TPP is this multinational, Asian-targeted, free trade, fair trade agreement that was negotiated over a long period of time. And the real goal of the TPP was to have good trade relations with the countries surrounding China, so that China wouldn't move in and become a hegemon for that whole Asian continent, which is what China's goal was. And then ultimately this might bring China to the bargaining table to have fairer trade with the United States. There were provisions of this agreement that were objectionable, even to the United States. They were quite open about that. It was an agreement that was negotiated over a period of time with many countries with competing goals. Does anybody here know much about the agreement or have feelings about the TPP? Some of you guys are trade lawyers. Do you want to tell us
Not
what...
because I'm a trade lawyer,
Okay.
just reading in the news.
So tell us what your thoughts are on this.
I mean,
There's a
to
microphone.
me, the ultimate goal was to deal with China. I think that's what I believe the ultimate goal was, but it also was to make better relations with the partners. And as you said, there were some provisions that we didn't like, but overall, the overall goal, and that's true, I think, with any treaty, with any law, with anything that us lawyers deal with. So
Right.
I thought it was a good idea, and many people and many Republicans thought it was a good idea. I mean, it didn't get just invented by, as the president sometimes says, invented by President Obama. It wasn't.
Right. And so, one of the things is traditionally the Republican Party was the free trade party. Trump runs on an anti-free trade platform. Hillary moves in that direction as well. And ultimately, you don't have anybody supporting free trade in major politics. There was concern after this was killed that NAFTA too would be killed. But apparently, the Trump team understands that NAFTA has many benefits to the United States. And so the initiative now is to renegotiate NAFTA, not to kill it. Interestingly, the Canadians are not opposed to renegotiation because what they view is that NAFTA was weakened because it was North America, including Mexico. And what the Canadians would love is just a U.S.-Canada free trade agreement that would be more favorable to both of those countries and not have some of the issues that were glammed on because of Mexico. Well, we'll see how that goes. But in this case, I was actually in China the day of the election. And when they announced it was Trump, the Chinese were ecstatic. And I was like, why do you like Trump? And there were two reasons, they said. One we'll talk about later in a few minutes, which was about human rights. But the other one was this. They said, we have this one belt, one road initiative. Our goal right now is to expand our economy and economic relations to all the countries in Asia, including most of the countries that the TPP was going to focus on. Trump's victory is our victory, which means to me that this is our loss for the United States, if China looks at it that way. All right, so that's my opinion. Next, President Trump withdraws from the climate accord. Many of the people in the Trump administration that he has appointed to major agencies deny there is such thing as climate change or global warming caused by human activity. I would venture to guess that everybody in this room believes that there's climate change. I think this week, when we saw 5 major hurricanes lined up, an event that never happened in the history, in recorded history, we thought maybe something's going on with the climate. And there's much other evidence that you'd have to be blind to deny, including the melting of the polar ice caps, the rising of the sea levels, the heating of the oceans, the record temperatures we're all seeing. So this accord wasn't perfect. It was mostly voluntary, but it was something where the countries in the world were taking a step to try to, and it was a unanimous step. Everybody agreed to it. And President Trump gets to Paris and he says, guess what? We're out. The business community, interestingly, put a lot of pressure on Trump not to do that. And this is because the business community is realizing that climate change is bad for them and being seen as a green business is good for business. And you would think a traditional Republican would have been moved by that. But Trump's base is against climate change. They bought into the idea that whatever regulations we would be putting in place was going to kill our economy. And so this was the first major event of the Trump administration that sent a signal to the world that the U.S. is not just an exceptionist country under Trump, it is a completely isolated country and doesn't mind the isolation. And this is going to have broader ramifications, I believe. Does anybody want to comment on that? Because if you have an alternate view, I'm all open to that. These are just my personal views. And like I say, my expertise is war crimes. So when I'm into climate change and these other issues, I probably know as much as you all do in the room, but I'm just putting it together. Okay, the next one. President Trump declared his intention to pull us out of the Iranian nuclear accord. Now, if you guys remember, this is what happened. Iran, like North Korea, was moving toward getting the nuclear bomb. They are located in the Middle East, very close within striking distance of our ally Israel and other allies in the area. And so during the previous administration, they negotiated a deal that was not just U.S. and Iran, but it was a multinational negotiation. And what it ended up doing is lifting sanctions that had been imposed on Iran, just like the ones that have been imposed on North Korea through the Security Council, in return for Iran agreeing to have a very transparent process for monitoring the fact that it is not going to be developing nuclear weapons and that it will be using its nuclear energy in peaceful ways. Again, none of these agreements are foolproof. None of them are 100% successful. There were a lot of people that said, oh, Iran's is going to cheat. But the State Department under the Trump administration has now 4 times certified that Iran is not in substantial compliance, it is in full compliance. And so Donald Trump is having a hard time saying we need to pull out of this accord because it's not working, because his State Department and Tillerson are reporting to Congress that the sanctions that we unilaterally lifted will stay lifted. The other side of the coin is that sanctions don't work internationally if just one country imposes them. It only works when the whole world does it. And so that's why the North Korean sanctions with China now complying are so important. This was a sanction regime that had been imposed by the UN Security Council, just like in North Korea. When it was lifted, if the U.S. reimposes unilateral sanctions, it will have very little effect on Iran. In fact, Iran got from the U.S. the major things it wanted. One of them was a very embarrassing media moment, which was we gave them back some of the money that had been frozen. For some reason, we decided to do that in cash and deliver it at an airport with just these giant crates. I have no idea why somebody in the administration, this is the previous administration, would think that was a good idea. But Iran got what it wanted. And so now I think the other problem for the Trump administration is that there's very little the U.S. can do unilaterally, especially if Iran continues to comply. But I pay attention to this because the U.S. Trump's administration does not like Iran. It sees it as the root of all the evil in the Middle East. He made a major speech when he was in Saudi Arabia where he said there are two kinds of Muslims. There are Sunnis and there are Shiites, and countries that are dominated by Shiites we consider the enemy. They're dangerous. And he was talking about Iran, but there are a lot of other countries that might apply to throughout the Middle East, and that's a new and weird way of dividing up the Middle East, in my opinion. All right. Then he... Probably this was the biggest issue that got everybody's attention, especially the lawyers. He announced that if you were from one of 7 Muslim-dominated countries, the Middle East, you would not be able to be an immigrant to the United States. And also we were going to suspend all refugee immigration while we studied whether there was, in fact, infiltration by ISIS and al-Qaeda through refugee flows. I mean, that was basically the theory. Notwithstanding the fact that there has never been a refugee that has exploded a bomb or done any terrorist acts in the United States. But this was the theory. All right, this was an interesting moment for lawyers across America because what happened was people were detained at airports. And you guys all remember this, seeing this in the news. There was a mass initiative by Americans' lawyers, and many of them were at a firm that was founded by one of Case Western's alums, Austin Fragaman. It's the biggest immigration law firm in the world, and it's based in New York. And most of his lawyers went off, paired with nonprofit lawyers, to the different airports around the world. And this was a moment that the press seized upon and said, lawyers are heroes once again. It was sort of the Atticus Finch To Kill a Mockingbird moment in our millennium about lawyers. And this was a time, lawyers have had a bad rap for a long time, and it reminded Americans that lawyers are important bulwark against dictators, fascists, and even presidents who are overreaching. And it reminds me of the old quote from William Shakespeare, where it says, first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. And people who don't know the origins of that quote think, oh yeah, even Shakespeare knew that lawyers were trouble. But the context of that was that this character, Jack in Henry VI, wanted to overturn the government. And he said, the only thing in our way, really, are lawyers. And he said, so the first thing we need to do if we're going to have a successful coup is get rid of all the lawyers. That's to remind you how important lawyers are, even back in Shakespeare's times. And I think that this moment reminded Americans the important role that lawyers played. This case is going to go to the Supreme Court next month. And there is a new Supreme Court justice. He actually gave his last public speech at our law school before becoming confirmed. I thought he was a pretty smart guy, rational. We'll see how political he is, when this comes out, which side he sides on. The Supreme Court, in its initial decision, seemed to indicate that they thought that the ban was overreaching, and they put in an exception for people who have ties to the United States, including broad family ties, not just parents and sisters and brothers, but also grandparents, aunts, and uncles. All right, so continuing on this. Then when President Trump goes to Saudi Arabia, he announced America's human rights policy to the world. And he said, America will no longer seek to impose our way of life on others. And this is what made China particularly happy, because the most difficult thing in their relations with the United States over the last few administrations has been that we beat up on them. When we're negotiating economic trade policies and initiatives, we keep mentioning human rights, and they just don't like that because their idea of human rights is quite different than ours, and they're not going to radically change, and they're just getting tired of hearing it. So 3 cheers for Trump, said the Chinese. This is troubling to me because one of the things that the United States has always had is not just economic might and military might, but a moral authority based on our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, our history, which has been checkered, but has been mostly on the right side. We're a country that prides itself for fighting World War I for democracy, to make the world safe again for democracy. We're a country that has, created, initiated, exported our due process rights throughout the world and has been a big proponent for human rights. And I think that is one of our strengths as a country. Now, you have to be smart about human rights in how you enforce them and how you negotiate with countries over them. But this seems to indicate that human rights are not going to be important at all for the next 3.5 years. Now, I'm going to ask another question that might be the most provocative of all. There is something that Donald Trump did that has people thinking that, ironically, he may go down as the president that did the most for human rights of any president in modern times in a particular segment. And what I'm talking about is the April 7th attack on Syria when it used chemical weapons. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about that and figuring out whether this Trump administration, which I have said has been assaulting international law and human rights, is actually, and ironically, paradoxically, going to go down as the administration that changed the world for the better in the world of human rights. All right, so the background is this. President Assad is a very cruel dictator-like president. He has been committing crimes against humanity against his own people in order to stay in power during an uprising that was part of the Arab Spring set of uprisings. He's used barrel bombs, he's used strafing attacks, mass killings of his civilian population, and ultimately he has resorted to chemical weapons. Some people wonder, where did he get his chemical weapons? And others wonder, where did the chemical weapons that were supposed to be in Iraq end up? And maybe there is a dotted line, I don't know. But apparently it's not that hard to get chemical weapons. And we're talking about sarin gas, mustard gas, the worst kinds of stuff. And when you use chemical weapons, it basically melts you from the inside, and it melts your skin off, and it kills widely, and if you don't have a gas mask and full protection, you're going to die or suffer a very short and painful demise. So that's chemical weapons. And since World War I, chemical weapons have been prohibited by international law. There's a whole series of treaties. And it's actually a series of treaties that has been enforced. After World War I, the countries in the world said, the chemical weapons are really horrible. We don't want to fight with them. No good can come of them. So they really have done a good job of banning them. And yet, Assad has them. He used them during the Obama administration. And President Obama famously said, that's a red line. If you do it again, we are going to attack. And then he did it again. And President Obama said, oh, okay, there's another red line. And if you do that again, we are going to attack. And the cartoon there makes it very clear. Actually, what happened was his entire cabinet had voted to intervene during one of the attacks with chemical weapons. And he ended up overruling all of them. And he claims that it was his Kennedy moment where John F. Kennedy's cabinet said, let's go to nuclear war against Russia. And Kennedy said, no, this is during the Cuban Missile Crisis, let's give it a couple more days. Let's see if we can work something out. And ironically, it was Putin who gave Obama the excuse not to do anything. He negotiated a peace agreement that would disarm Assad's chemical weapons that was a complete and utter sham, because since then, he's continued to stockpile and use chemical weapons. This was not a good moment for the Obama administration, and I think that Donald Trump made, and all the other Republicans who ran for president, made a big deal about that, and it resonated with the American people. We were not proud of this. So Trump wanted to be seen as different. What happened was on April 7th, he fired not one, but 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles at an air base just north of Damascus where the Assad regime had launched the chemical weapons, not where they were storing them, but where they had launched the attack from. And the idea was that this was going to be the red line. They crossed it. We are showing up. We are proving that this is not acceptable. President Trump gives a speech in which he says that this is in response to the use of chemical weapons and that this is a proportionate and appropriate response. He does not articulate a legal rationale. But what else could it be but humanitarian intervention? Because it was chemical weapons against civilians, and it wasn't against one of our allies, it wasn't against us, it wasn't a whole lot of chemical weapons, but we said it wasn't going to stand. So the question then is this act going to be a tipping point that creates new customary international law that allows for humanitarian intervention? And the reason this is such an important legal issue is that the UN Charter basically says you're not allowed to use humanitarian intervention. You only are allowed to attack other countries for two reasons. And so Article 2, Paragraph 4 is the thou shalt not attack another country. And the two reasons are in Article 51, self-defense, and Article 42, when the UN Security Council authorizes it. Now, the U.S. did go to the Security Council and tried to get sanctions imposed on Assad, tried to get an international tribunal set up to prosecute him, tried to even authorize force. And what stopped us at the Security Council? Anybody know? Russia. Okay. Do you know why Russia loves Assad, why they will do anything to protect Assad? Do you guys know this? This is an interesting thing. It's all about geopolitical power. All right. Russia has 2 and only 2 warm water ports. All of their navy, which is pretty sizable, comes out of these 2 warm water ports. One of them is Sevastopol, which is in the Crimea. Alarm bells going off. Do you guys know why Russia has invaded the Crimea and taken it over when an anti-Russian president was elected in the Ukraine? Because of this. And only because of this. And then the other one is Tartus, and Tartus is the biggest of all of them. And this is a picture of Tartus. Tartus has over 100 vessels, destroyers, aircraft carriers, minesweepers, you name it. The navy of the Russian fleet is in Assad's Tartus. Now, why is it there? It's because they've made a deal. As long as Assad stays in power, Russia gets to have the base at Tartus. If Assad falls, Russia loses its base. It is unacceptable to Russia for that to happen. So you will never see Russia allow for anything that will cripple Assad, which is problematic because Assad is basically completely unpopular in his own country. He's doing horrible things, including using chemical weapons. He's creating the biggest refugee flow in the history of the world out of Syria, and is going to ultimately destabilize the countries in the region, including European countries, Turkey, Greece. As far north as the UK, you're seeing issues with the refugees that flow out of Syria, and then Jordan is completely overwhelmed. The Syrian refugee flow makes the Palestinian flow 40 years ago look like a drop, and this is going to have consequences for a long, long time. All right, so in the midst of this, we couldn't get Security Council authorization, so there is a precedent for using force for humanitarian intervention, but the precedent is the 1999 NATO intervention into Serbia. And the context there was that Serbia was ethnically cleansing the Kosovar Albanians, which were Muslims, from the province of Kosovo. And they were going from city to city, town to town, and burning them out. Most of these people went up into the mountains, and it was August, September when this happened. The winter in Serbia in Kosovo is super cold. The mountains are very high. This is not far from the Sarajevo Olympics, for the downhill skiing venues and everything from, I think, 1976. So this is a place where these people were going to freeze to death, and there were 400,000 of them basically camping out without any food and water and shelters and clothing. And so the NATO countries got together and said, we got to stop this. This is going to be a genocide. They couldn't get Security Council authorization because, once again, Russia was allied with Serbia, with Slobodan Milosevic. So they just decided, without any kind of self-defense rationale, that they would do this because it was the right thing. And after 89 days, President Milosevic agreed to a peace agreement where the UN got to take over Kosovo, and Kosovo is now on its way to becoming an independent country with the help of the UN, and the ethnic cleansing stopped. After this happened, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, said, these NATO airstrikes, they were unlawful, but they were legitimate. And as a lawyer, which all of you guys are in the room, That's troubling to me. If it's unlawful, how is it legitimate? What is he saying? I mean, I guess he was saying it's like it was a good result. And in the end, the UN Security Council, which didn't authorize it, did ratify it because they did put peacekeeping troops afterwards and they never imposed any sanctions. There was no condemnation of any kind. So the international community kind of blinked. But he's not letting the U.S. and NATO get away with it. He's saying, yeah, it did violate the actual letter of the UN Charter. So what he did afterwards, because he realized that there's a problem with the UN Charter, that it allows this kind of thing to happen, not just in Serbia, but in Rwanda, in Darfur, and other places where there's a paralysis at the Security Council, he created a group that came up with this new concept called the Responsibility to Protect Doctrine. And they even gave it a bumper sticker name, the R2P Doctrine, Responsibility to Protect, so R, the number 2P. All right, so what does this doctrine do? It says that when there's a case where you have just cause, and it defines that as genocide or crimes against humanity, like what's going on in Rwanda and in Serbia, and you have right intention. So it's not a pretext for a land grab. It's not a pretext to topple a government. It's just an action to save people's lives. And it's last resort because the Security Council is paralyzed and the General Assembly is not able to use its Uniting for Peace special resolution where it also can authorize force. And then the force is proportionate and there's a quick exit. If you do all those things, according to this report, it should be allowed as an exception to the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force. So this is just a report. This is not actual law. The report goes to the General Assembly, and the General Assembly waters it down, and then it goes to the Security Council, and the Security Council sticks in a clause that completely emasculates the report. And what it does is it says, we endorse the concept. When a country is abusing its own people and there are crimes against humanity, the international community should act, and this is what it said. And it's only allowed when the UN Security Council authorizes it. So that totally undermined the whole idea of this initiative and set back the idea that there is humanitarian intervention unilaterally without Security Council authorization quite a bit. All right, now since then, there have been a variety of uses of the doctrine. One of them, the most recent one, was Mount Sinjar. This was a mountain where the Azadis, which are a Kurdish offshoot, had been ethnically cleansed by the ISIS people. And this is in the very northern region of Iraq. And so, actually, maybe it was southern region of Syria. It's like right near the border. Anyway, they're up there on the mountain, and the ISIS people put a ring around them so that they can't come out. It's hot, they're thirsty, they're hungry, they're going to die. There's 30,000 of them up there. And so even though both Iraq and Syria at the time did not authorize anybody to use force in their territory, President Obama actually just couldn't deal with the idea of these people dying, and he ordered an airstrike on the ISIS positions, and ISIS scattered. The Kurds came in, and they escorted the Azadis down. And this is one of those things people probably don't focus on, but President Obama saved 30,000 people by violating international law. But he did that in one night. And nobody, except for maybe Syria, complained about this action. And was this just a hiccup, a one-time deal? Was it an exception to the rule? What was it? The Obama administration did not claim that there's a new right of humanitarian intervention. He just said, look, it was horrible, I had to do something. And this is a president who was very committed to international law. So it wasn't like he said, I don't believe in international law. He would never say that. There were other times when the U.S. has used humanitarian intervention and hasn't engendered a lot of protest. One was when, after the first Desert Storm, the invasion of Iraq and Kuwait to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. What? Yeah, but so we did that. We attacked, and then we actually, I guess under the Bush administration, encouraged the people to have an uprising. We thought would be successful. So the Marsh Arabs in the southern part of Iraq did an uprising, and then he started slaughtering them from the air. And we felt guilty about that, so we created a no-fly zone with no Security Council authorization. And for 10 years, we actually imposed a no-fly zone so that the Iraqi Air Force could not rain death down from the skies on these people who we had carelessly convinced to try to do a failed uprising. That wasn't protested by anybody but Iraq, and it sort of created a precedent that people don't really focus on. So there are these precedents that are slowly building up toward humanitarian intervention, and it could be that what happened in April was the tipping point. Now, to counter that, in international law, whatever concepts you have, it goes under the theory of reciprocity and systemic reciprocity. In other words, if we come up with a new principle, it's not just that we can use it, but any country in the world can use it, and they can use it against other countries, and the other countries might be our friends and allies, and we might be sorry that we came up with the new principle. Well, in this case, Russia has been using the R2P doctrine. First, they did it when they attacked South Ossetia, Georgia, which I alluded to before, and then more recently when they attacked the Crimea. Their theory is that there are native cultural Russians that live in those areas, that the governments that came to power through democratic elections or otherwise were anti the Russians, and they were starting to abuse them and repress them, and that something had to happen. So Russia claims the right of R2P. Now, these cases can be easily distinguished. There was no genocide or crimes against humanity. There was no use of chemical weapons. These are countries that are on the border of Russia. Russia went in and they stayed in. In one case, they annexed the Crimea. In the other case, they have de facto annexed it. So it's a land grab. Therefore, they don't actually comply with those different provisions of the R2P doctrine. But what it does show is the risk of humanitarian intervention, because it's not so easy to draw those lines. It's a slippery slope, and if we start using it, then other countries, including Russia and many other countries, will start using it, and it will make the world more destable, less safe. So this is the problem, and probably the reluctance of the United States to finally say, yes, we believe in humanitarian intervention. That's what we were doing on April 7th. Interestingly, the United Kingdom has no qualms at all. They are the only country in the world that has been pushing to have recognition of this new right. There are some other countries that are interested in this, but it's not going to happen if the U.S. does not articulate a legal rationale that corresponds with what it's doing. Let's see what the next one is. And this is because customary international law is created by two things. One is widespread state action, and I think we have that. We're seeing that there are humanitarian interventions, there are no condemnations, there's international support, that the actions like what happened do seem to be making new law. But the second thing you need is something called opinio juris, which is a Latin phrase that means a sense of legal obligation or legal acceptance. In other words, it wasn't just something you did out of convenience. You did it because you thought you had a legal right to do it. And in order for that to occur, you have to articulate a legal rationale. That's what hasn't happened. So what I believe is we have to keep our eyes on what's going on in Syria, because I have no doubt that Assad will use chemical weapons again. And if he does, one of three things will happen. One is the United States won't do anything. We'll say, well, that was a one-off. We're not going to do it this time. Russia's mad at us from attacking last time or something, in which case then we didn't establish any precedent. The second thing is we may attack and we may create a legal rationale for doing so. And we say, we believe we have the right to do this and explain why. And that would, in fact, create, I think, the tipping point for new customary international law. And that would make the Trump administration the administration that will go down in history as creating new customary international law for human rights. And that's the paradox. The third thing is that he would just respond and not make any legal argument, and then in which case we have to wait for another situation to arise because the waters will still be too murky. There's another thing that's going on with this. When Trump attacked on April 7th, he warned the Russians. The Russians then warned the Syrians. Even though we used 59 cruise missiles, which if you put them in a city would have destroyed blocks and blocks of a city, They did almost no damage to this particular air base, and within 48 hours, the air base was in operation again. The Syrians had moved their aircraft out, so almost no aircraft had been damaged. And so if the idea was to destroy the delivery mechanisms for chemical weapons, that didn't happen. If the idea was to send a signal to Assad that we're serious, we're going to destroy you, give you, what Trump says about North Korea, make it, you pay so much, it makes shock and awe look like a tiny thing. We didn't do that either, because by tipping them off, nothing much happened, So some people believe all April 7th was a PR stunt. It was just Trump being able to tweet that I'm different than Obama. When I said there was a red line, I meant it. And his, base felt that was his president delivering and showing that he was better than the other president. If that's all it was, then this is not going to create new international law. But like I said, it'll be tested, and I think it'll be tested soon. So do you have any questions and thoughts on this situation or anything in international law in the Trump administration? We do have about 15 minutes, and I also would love to spend a little bit of time updating you about the law school. So there you go.
Sort of two questions related to. Thank you. On these last topics you spoke about, in the well, let's get to this last one. Can you go back one slide?
Sure.
I lost my train of thought. The microphone messed me up. Do you think that in the next administration or a couple future administrations, if somebody takes the same action, that would be a stronger argument that this is the new norm, that this customary international law is changed?
So customary international law, it's created, it's a little bit squishy. It's created when you have this widespread state practice. But how do you know the moment that it's done? It's sort of like asking, how do you know when a house is completed, right? It's not just when you put up the pillars and the sides and the roofs, but it's not when you put the last window panes in either. At some point, you've got a house. And it's the same thing with customary international law. Each of these precedents is building toward what is ultimately a tipping point. And it may be, as you say, that history will wait for another administration to see how to judge these. These could be judged as, movement along a line that leads to humanitarian intervention, but it may await the next administration. And one of the other things about history is it's often easy to think you see a major fundamental change in something when it's happening, and you could be wrong about it. You often need a couple of years to see the big picture. So I think you're right. If this is happening, it may take more years for us to even understand that this has occurred. So, yes?
Assuming that it was in place assuming that it was in place as originally I guess announced, and so Russia wouldn't qualify in either case. What are some of the negatives of if that were in place? Are there negatives?
Yeah, well, so I think you have to look at each of the four criteria, and because they seem very explicit, but you can see. Whoops, let's go back and see them. Okay, so just cause. The original report said genocide and crimes against humanity. Okay, genocide is pretty easy to know. It's when you're destroying an entire population. It has to be an ethnic, racial, religious, or national population. What if all you're doing is destroying your enemies, your opponents, your political opponents? That actually doesn't qualify as genocide. Now, crimes against humanity is broader. That's any systematic and widespread attacks against a civilian population. But that has been defined in all the international tribunals as really broad attacks. So you see in Cambodia, about 1 million people, Uganda, 500,000 people, Bosnia, 250,000 people, Rwanda, 800,000 people. I mean, large numbers. In Iraq, in Syria, there have been 15,000 civilian deaths, which is small. And there were only 100 deaths from the chemical weapons attack. Now, 49 of them were kids, and there are videos of these kids just bubbled up and dying of chemical weapons, and that was so powerful it made the entire world really angry. But that's only 100 people. And under international law, 100 people probably doesn't qualify as a crime against humanity. So what this would have to be is an expansion of even that doctrine. We would have to say, well, there's something about chemical weapons because they've been banned for so long, they're so heinous that even if they kill just 100 people, that qualifies for the R2P doctrine. And that would actually be an expansion, I think, of what the R2P doctrine was originally thought of. So that's the first problem. You go down to right intention. I said if it was a pretext for a land grab or something else, like a government overthrow, that doesn't work. What about if the pretext was just politics? We didn't do this to save people's lives. It wasn't calculated to save people's lives. It was just calculated to make Trump look good. Or let's be even more charitable. Let's say that the reason was to force Assad to the negotiating table in Geneva, but not to save lives, but just to get him to start negotiations. Either way, that doesn't fit perfectly into these criteria. The third one, last resort, well, yes, the Security Council is paralyzed, but I mentioned briefly the UN has this thing called the Uniting for Peace resolution. And when the Security Council is paralyzed, you can go to the UN and get a 2/3 vote. And it's only been done a couple of times in history, and I think the world is concerned about it because they don't want to weaken the Security Council by having the General Assembly do an end run. But they could have done that, and there was no effort to go that route. And it wasn't like this happened so fast that they didn't have a chance to do that. It was 10 days from the chemical weapons use to the attack. So, and then finally, the proportionate force and the quick exit. Well, yeah, it was a quick exit. In this case, ironically, the force wasn't overbroad, which you usually worry about. I think the force was maybe like by giving the warning and by only shooting the missiles at a runway that was empty, it was like meaningless force. So even this case doesn't fit so perfectly into the responsibility to protect doctrine. And as all lawyers do, you look at the rules and you try to apply the facts to it, and every case is going to be an imperfect fit. So, yes?
This is a broad question, but you had a great broad presentation. Compare and contrast Teddy Roosevelt and Donald Trump international relations.
Okay. Maybe let me actually have you do it, because Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Rider, he sent the military out to the Philippines. Tell me what your thoughts are on that.
Well, everybody now sees Roosevelt manifest destiny,
Yeah.
and we were entitled to this. Now, he didn't have to deal with even the United Nations. He just went out and did what he wanted to do, and history now views him as a great president, and he did what we need to do to justify ourselves. Will Donald Trump try and put himself in that category? Is there some reason he does not belong in that category?
Okay, so, the biggest change between now is that the world is a much more complicated place. So many countries have weapons of mass destruction. We're much more interdependent. And so what our allies think matters more to us, and having their cooperation. Also, we're not in a place anymore where the United States has unlimited economic resources to fight. We already have this battle in Afghanistan. There's the longest war in American history. Now it's 16 years. We have more and more troops in Syria and in Iraq. And we're thinking about a naval attack on North Korea, and we have to be credible. So one of the problems for the United States, I think, is when we do things alone, it costs a lot of money, it stretches our military, and when we do things with allies, it actually is economically in our interest. And that wasn't so much the case back then. There wasn't a UN, there wasn't a coalition back then like we have now. So I think those are the differences, but I would not be surprised at all if Trump, looks at Teddy Roosevelt as the role model and believes that sometimes the president just has to do what he thinks is right, and all those allies and the Congress, be damned. Oh, I should mention the other thing about Congress is for these requirements for just cause and right intention and everything, you would think you would also want to get authorization from Congress and domestically for any military action that's humanitarian intervention. We have not had to worry about that for what's going on in most of the Middle East. So all of our attacks on ISIS and al-Qaeda because we actually have congressional authorization that came after 9/11 and has been renewed. It's called the AUMF, the Authorization to Use Military Force. And what it says is that we're allowed to use military force against those responsible for 9/11. And so broadly, that's al-Qaeda and ISIS, and we've been attacking them all over the world using that. You can't use that against Assad for his chemical weapons attacks. So we really did not have any congressional authorization for this military strike. And I think that also, in a way, weakens it, not internationally, but domestically. And to go back to Teddy Roosevelt's analogy, I think Trump would say, well, Teddy Roosevelt didn't get authorization when he sent the fleet out. He said, I've sent it out. If they want it, if Congress wants it back, let's see them bring it back, right? So maybe there is an analogy to how he's thinking about himself. You had your hand up?
Yeah, thank you. You used the phrase customary international law, and I'm thinking that there's so many different factions and viewpoints that it must be very difficult to have a consensus about what is customary in international law, and I was wondering if you could provide any examples besides this issue of humanitarian relief.
Oh, sure. So the last book I wrote was called Customary International Law in Times of Fundamental Change. So it addressed the very question that you asked. And so it said, are there times when customary international law, which generally grows very slowly over decades and centuries, and it takes a long time for everybody to agree on, something like the law of the sea that says that the territorial sea of a country, which is part of our territory, extends 12 nautical miles out from our coastal regions. That was based on that was how far cannons could shoot. And over centuries, the world agreed on that. Sometimes there are events like perhaps chemical weapons use in Syria or the killing of the Assadis, the attempted killing of them, of the Assadis up on Mount Sinjar, that can accelerate that. And so the book looks at these times in international law where that has happened. So the first one was Nuremberg. Before the Nuremberg trials, the rule was that what a country did to its own people was its own business. You could not prosecute leaders for hurting their own people. And Nuremberg changed all of that. And immediately after Nuremberg, you have this whole concept of human rights law, international criminal law. You can't use the obedience to orders defense for these international crimes. Leaders can be prosecuted by international courts. All of that happens in one event at Nuremberg. Yeah. Well, not really, actually. It was codified in the Nuremberg Charter, which was the charter that the 4 Allied powers and 22 other countries signed up for. And then the UN passed a resolution that merely endorsed the principles of Nuremberg, but didn't actually write down what they were. And that was a non-binding resolution of the General Assembly of the UN. So kind of codified, but not in a treaty that people ratified. Okay, so the next one probably was space law. 1957, Sputnik goes up. The whole world realizes that we now have the ability not just to put satellites in space, but to put weapons in space, which was the real concern. And so there was a space race between the United States and Russia. And there was no rules about the law of outer space. And the closest analogy would have been the law of the sea or the law of the land and airspace. And they decided to go and have a completely different set of rules. So, for example, the law of the land and airspace would say if you fly a rocket over people's countries, you have to have permission, and if you don't have permission, then you violated their airspace. That's not how it is for flying peaceful rockets and satellites up in space. Also, when you park a satellite in geosynchronous orbit, which means it stays in the same place over the same country and it rotates with the Earth, you would have to get permission and pay the country below it a fee. That's not how that works. If an astronaut landed on your territory, you would treat them like Gary Powers, who jumped out of the U-2, and he was treated as a spy. But that's not how it works for astronauts. They're treated as ambassadors of all mankind, and they're surrendered peacefully to their original country. So they created a whole set of rules based on what 2 countries were doing for about 10 years at the early years of space. They did pass some General Assembly resolutions that didn't codify them in terms of a treaty, but they did confirm these rules. And the General Assembly of the UN doesn't have the authority to make law. They can confirm existing law. They can talk about aspirations, and I suppose that's what happened. So space law happened really quickly because of technology. The next one was probably the law of the continental shelf. So it used to be that a country's territorial jurisdiction extended only 12 nautical miles, and we wanted to start doing oil drilling throughout the Gulf of Mexico and off the coast of Alaska, and other countries wanted to as well. So President Truman did a proclamation, and he made it up. He said, our territory, for purposes of exploitation, extends all the way out to the farthest reaches of our ability to exploit, and ultimately it's now 200 nautical miles. And that happened really quickly as well. So there are times, and the book is full of like a dozen more, where customary international law happens quickly, usually because of technological changes, sometimes because of some horrendous military action like World War II with the Holocaust. And when that happens, sometimes it takes a while. History has to catch up with it and look at it after the fact. But it does. It makes fundamental paradigm shifts in international law. And this may be one of those. And the reason I think this is so fascinating is, wouldn't it be paradoxical and ironic if the president who did this was Donald Trump? Let me spend just a couple minutes telling you about what's new up the road at University Circle, especially for you who are alumni. I mentioned that it's the 125th anniversary of our law school. Who doesn't have plans yet for October 6th in the evening for dinner? I want to invite you to have dinner with me and the entire faculty of the law school at the Western Reserve Historical Society. And we are going to be giving out this new 125th anniversary book and our video, which I mentioned before. We're going to have the carousel going, and you're going to see all your friends, not just from your class, but the classes ahead of you, below you, and others. And the faculty are dying to see you again. So we've been sending out emails and hard copy invitations. Pull one of those up or go to our website, and it would be great to see you for that. If you haven't been to the law school lately, who hasn't been there for over a year? Raise your hand. Okay. Who's been there in the last year? Well, that's okay. Well, that's great. So those who have been there recently, the newest thing is the room that is right across the hall from the moot court room, which is A5152. No, A6162. We made it a big double room, and we made it all high-tech, and it's called our active learning classroom. So it's a classroom for the new millennium. And it's got all these computers and pods and portable tables, and you can have people working together in these little groups, and they can all be connected. It is so cool what you can do with technology. And we got a grant that paid for this, and so that's our new gem, just completed over the summer. The moot court room, where we have all of our major events, thanks to the generosity of the Baker Hostetler law firm, we did a major refurbishment of the moot court room. So if you've been there in the last year, you've seen that it's a much nicer space for us. We have a new IP venture clinic, and every year for the last 3 years since we started this, and this is being paid for by a grant we got from the Burton D. Morgan Foundation, our students have been working with 30 startups. From originally it was just our university, now Northeast Ohio, and now even nationally. Last year, one of our startups won the national championship for concussion protocols. It's going to revolutionize concussion technology. The year before, one of our startups created a plasma jet engine that's 50% more efficient than anything that's flying. And then last year, the students worked with NASA to have it tested in the NASA laboratory here, and it works. And so President Obama invited the inventor, and the inventor said, can I bring my lawyer along? And President Obama said, no, you don't get to bring your lawyer. He goes, but my lawyer is a student at the law school, because this is all part of our clinic. And so this was like a really special thing. And then a lot of good stuff's going on at the law school. Last year was our best year in decades for the success of our moot court teams. And so the national moot court team won regionals and came in, I think, 8th in the country. The Jessup moot court team got the Best Brief Award and Best Speaker Award. The VIS moot court team that goes to Vienna won the Best Speaker Award out of 1,200 people, and it was a 1L who did it. So it was a really good year for moot court. We have the new curriculum that's much more experiential than almost any law school in the country, and it was recognized in the 2017 U.S. News and World Report rankings issue as one of the 5 leaders in experiential education. We're still highly ranked in our health law, 9th, international law, 12th, and I've given you guys the brochure that's hot off the press. It's a magazine about what we're doing in international law. I hope you'll spend a couple minutes looking at it in your leisure. And our IP law and our public interest law. is taking off. After a number of years of decreases in applications to law schools, the country is seeing a giant upswing in the test takers for the LSAT. Some people believe it is a Trump bump. I think there's something to this as well. There's a survey that showed that many of the people that are applying now are interested in public interest and sort of fighting against the government and doing the right thing. So we have a new public interest law scholarship called the Stephanie Tubbs Jones Public Interest Law Scholarship, and it ranges from half to full scholarship. We're giving it to a dozen people, and so we're launching that to try to capture the interest right now. And Stephanie Tubbs Jones, of course, was one of our alums and would be here today if she hadn't, or in Congress, if she hadn't died early. So lots of exciting things going on at your alma mater. We hope you'll visit, and especially come on October 6th. Any other questions about the school or anything?
How was placement for the last class?
Oh, and I'm glad you asked that. So when Jessica Berg and I came in as co-deans, placement was down nationwide. We were at 87%. We're at 93%. And that makes us one of the best in the country. And that also attracts a lot of interest in people. That's in part due to the help of our alums. You guys are very helpful in terms of, when our students interview at your firms, you take a focus on that. You've mentored our students. We've been placing our students in externships where they're getting these experiences, and sometimes those are due to our alums. And then ultimately, our alums are giving our students scholarships. We're able to really compete and get the best students we can possibly get. So thank you all for your support for the students in the school. Yes?
Do you view yourself as a national law school?
Yes.
Why?
Because 2/3 of our students come from outside of Ohio, 2/3 of our alums live outside of Ohio, and we're nationally ranked in major specialty areas that are in the cutting edge of law. So, and yet we also think of ourselves as based in Cleveland because this is our home, this is where I grew up, and this is where many of our best alums are. So, all right, with that, let me say thank you for all coming. And let's hope the tribe makes the record 21 today, right?